sales volumes dropped 72%. So that's how
Oh,
much industrial sales transactions dropped off. The craziest part, though,
Chad Griffiths, my favorite Canadian YouTuber slash podcaster slash industrial investor. How are you?
I'm doing really good, Joe. Thanks so much for having me on the show again, and always good to see you.
That's great to see you. Thank you for taking the time. I know you're super busy, but I want to do a industrial outlook for 2024, and there's nobody else that I would reach out to get that. And let's just dive right into it. And what do you think is going to be what's going to be happening in industrial in 2024?
My best guess is that will ebb and flow with what interest rates do to a large extent.
Right.
And we heard yesterday the news that they were suggesting there could be a few rate cuts in 2024. Then this morning comes out and they're like, well, maybe we won't, not necessarily any guidance. I think early part of 2024 will be very similar to what we experienced this year, which was very slow industrial transaction numbers. And there was a stat that just came out, which I found really interesting, so I'll share that with you. It was some data that tracked sales volumes from October 2022 to October 2023. So they just didn't have November's data out yet. So that was the month that they put out. And from October to October 2023, sales volumes dropped 72%. So that's how
Oh,
much industrial sales transactions dropped off. The craziest part, though, and it was across the board,
okay.
office, retail, multifamily, all saw big drops. But
Now, is this in the
industrial,
US and Canada?
just US,
Okay,
nationally in the
US.
US.
Okay.
But in industrial, prices went up 2%, which is the craziest thing. 72% drop in volume, but a 2% increase in prices. So I think that speaks to industrial being a fairly resilient asset class right now. And there's all sorts of data out there that are suggesting that there's growing demand for industrial. E-commerce is predicted to increase 15.8% year over year for the next 5 years. So that's going to require a lot more warehouse development. Then you add in reshoring and onshoring, nearshoring. That's going to actually bring more manufacturing real estate requirements. So I think industrial is going to do very well on the demand side. I think that there's going to be a considerable drop off in new construction and new development next year, just as a result of higher interest rates. So I think that the sales market is still going to be very tough. I think that trend of what we saw year over year is going to continue into 2023, but I can see leasing demand being very, very healthy. And that's probably why there's an uptick in prices, even though volumes dropped off so much.
Do you think that if interest rates come down a few points, you're going to see developments? It'll spike again, right?
It has to. I think that there's actually going to be a big supply imbalance if nothing changes. That by 2025, 2026, there's going to be a shortage, and then we're going to run into that same problem we had in 21, 22, when there just wasn't enough inventory and people were scrambling to get space. I think we could find ourselves in a position like that again, just because developers are pulling back plans to develop what they had in the pipeline. So
Right.
I think if interest rates come down, that would probably spark a construction frenzy. But I don't know what happens in 2024. Like I still think inflation is problematic.
Yeah.
So if anyone's guess what happens on the inflation and interest rate front. But I'd say unless something changes, if rates hold into 2024, it'll be an election year in the US. So there always seems to be some string pulling that happens in an election year. So maybe that changes conveniently around the summer, right
Right.
leading up to the voting. But I think it'll be status quo going into 2024. So I'd expect it to be flat on the new construction side, flat on the sales side, but still a lot of activity on the lease side.
Yeah. What about cold storage? How's that going? I mean, that there haven't been building hardly any of that, have they?
And that a lot of that inventory and that cold storage front is really old. Like it's
Yeah.
old product and it's really expensive to build new. Like you could just using really general numbers, you can build a new industrial building for $200 a square foot and have it ready to go. Or a cold storage building can be $400-500 a square foot. So it's really
Yeah.
expensive to build that. And for a developer or an investor to do that, they want to make sure there's a pretty solid company behind that. Otherwise, they're risking building out that high of a caliber of property, and then the tenant fails for whatever reason. So
Right.
there's a shortage of cold storage space. The inventory that's there is mostly pretty old, and it's really expensive to build. So I can see that being a problem in 2024 and beyond as well.
Oh, I would think so. Now, are you seeing, the average size of industrial out there? I saw you toured this massive industrial property a few weeks ago when you took the spill on the scooter. Which have you healed, by the way?
Yeah, I'm actually still wearing I'm wearing the pants right now, funny enough, that have a rip in them. So yeah, I scraped up my knee pretty good on that.
Oh, I saw it.
That was such a cool building. So it's a two-story multi multi-story industrial building in Seattle that Prologis built. And
Right.
it's not a two-story that you just think you could access with an elevator. It actually had a full engineered ramp up to the second level
I
where
saw
semi
it.
trucks could actually drive up that ramp, and it looked exactly like a normal building. That is one of the coolest buildings that I've seen. So it was worth taking a scooter wipe out to see it in person.
Well, I got to enjoy your video without hurting myself, so I appreciate you doing that. But that two-story, what is, I mean, and maybe you don't know this off the top of your head, but the extra construction costs for that second story, that's got to be pretty substantial. What were the rates like on that second floor? Were they the same as the lower level?
I would guess that they were the same. They've had Amazon's one of the tenants in there, and I think
Of
they
course.
had
Yeah, being up
think
there.
Home Depot. Yeah, I think Home Depot
Oh
was
yeah.
the other one. So they've been leased since that building was constructed. So I don't I would, if I was the broker advising them, I would think that the second floor is equally the same as the main floor, because
Right.
once you get up the ramp, and it was engineered and designed so that you could bring a full 53 footer in with no issues turning and pivoting. So
Yeah.
for all intents and purposes, when you were on the second floor, it looked exactly like main floor space. So I would say that the rates would be the same. The construction costs have got to be crazy expensive though. And
Yeah.
what I also found a little interesting is that because there was so much square footage on that building, that they needed to actually have a parkade, whereas most industrial buildings would never have a parkade. This, I think it
Right.
was a 4-story parkade that they had to have just because of the density that was on there. So that takes up space. And then
Sure.
also the ramps. They had a ramp on either side of the building. And again, these are large ramps to accommodate 53 footers. The amount of space that was required to take up these ramps would have been, otherwise, you could have just built that out as more warehouse space on a single
Right.
level. So I think it was a cool idea on how they did it. I'd be very curious to know the economics on it, on what they could have built size wise without having to engineer that second floor and go vertical and have higher ceilings and all the construction, and just build on the actual square footage on the land. I'd be very curious. I
Yeah.
suspect that because it was Prologis that did this, just the largest industrial company in the world, they're
Right.
always trying to push the envelope and be innovators. I suspect, I have no grounds for this at all, but I suspect that they did it more as a feather in the cap. Look what we're doing. This is how we're innovating, as opposed to making a sound economic decision. But they,
Yeah.
feel free, if someone from Prologis is listening, feel free to correct me, because
Yeah.
I'm just looking at it from the outside. But there was a lot of inefficiency in the form of those parkade, the ramps and the parkade, that you just wouldn't ordinarily have.
Yeah. So it's going to be big institutionals only. They're probably going to be going in there. Otherwise, how do you make that work? I mean, that's
I can't even imagine what the cost is to have those two major ramps in there, plus a parkade and all the ramps that go in the parkade. Like, that is a considerable cost. So
yeah.
it does solve the problem of having not enough land in certain markets. Like
Hmm.
LA is a good example.
Yep.
Seattle is an example. Vancouver, New York, New Jersey. Some of these port markets that just don't have enough land. It does make sense to consider going vertical. What I it's seeing the tea leaves that I'm reading is that we won't necessarily see multi-story buildings like this in the future. We'll probably see industrial story industrial buildings that just have 60, 80-foot ceiling heights.
Hmm.
And that wasn't possible 10 years ago, but with racking technology and
Yeah.
automation and robotics, some of these things can pick essentially as high as you can put it up. There's sprinkler implications, there's building code issues on how high you
Sure.
can build. But from if you really want to solve this density problem, I think that I would expect there to be more higher single story buildings as opposed to multi-story industrial buildings like that one in Seattle.
Yeah, I really think that if you go on YouTube and you see the Amazon way Amazon's doing with these robots, I mean, they can go. I don't know how high those ceilings were, but they were way up there, and I'm like, man, that would be structurally, that would be quite the task. But I could see where if you have the higher ceilings, you can get a lot more packed in there, and if you could utilize those robots, what an opportunity, you know. So
Funny you say that. Actually, there's a Amazon building in our market that just got completed, and it's a 3 million square foot building, but it's actually multi-story as well. It's 600,000 square feet per floor, but there's no ramps. It's all automation, it's all conveyor systems, all robotics that pick
yeah.
things from called the fourth floor, and then it goes through a conveyor system.
Hmm.
So that could be an option as well, maybe multi-story industrial, but utilizing technology as opposed to having to actually get the trucks up that ramp. But yeah, it's the industrial real estate market has changed. I've been in it for 18 years. It's changed more in the last couple years than I've seen in any time past.
Yeah, with these robotics, I think you're going to see it changing even faster because the video I watched, I mean, the robot would just go along, it just crawl up the wall and then go over to find out what it would, grab it, bring it over, put it down, and then drive over. And I'm like, my God, I could just see one mistake. I would have anxiety. I'd be sitting there staring at it all day, waiting for something to fall off or something to happen, but they've got it figured out.
Yeah, you're right though. Like I think that that's what it'll transition to. It'll transition from having laborers on
Hmm.
the floor moving things back and forth to having technicians and
Yeah.
maintenance guys that are overseeing this because it'll break down.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
everything that we have, phones, computers, cameras, everything breaks down. So it's
Sure. Yeah.
inevitable that it will. But I think that that's where it's going to transition to is there'll be people monitoring this elaborate system and fixing
Yeah. And it can go 24
things
7.
as they at 24/7, and they'll probably call them dark warehouses. So it'll be no lights in there because if it's
Right.
all automation, it's all robotics, they don't have any need for heat, air conditioning, they don't have any need for lights. So they'll
True.
be at like a true dark warehouse that a light only goes on if something needs to be fixed. So and then they go 24/7, like you said.
Right. Yeah. There's gonna be some big changes coming. Well, Chad, thank you very much. I know this have got a busy day going, so appreciate you taking the time. And if you guys, I'm gonna put Chad's email down below so you can reach out to him. If you have any questions, put in the comments below. I'll make sure Chad sees it. And if you don't know about Chad's channel, make sure you check it out on YouTube. It's under his name, Chad Griffiths. So, Chad, thank you very much for coming on today.
Thanks again, Joe. Huge fan of everything that you're doing. Keep up the awesome work.
Thank you. And for those of you watching, Chad knows a lot about this stuff, so I hope you can give us a like. And if you haven't done so, make sure you subscribe.